We have, as Amanda Ripley's book points out, we've lost ground in American education, substantial ground in American education, while others were reforming their systems. And she talks in this book about what is important. One of the things she tells us that is not important is money. We're already spending more money, and we spend in Kansas and Missouri. We're spending more money than the average OECD country. We're spending more money because we're roughly at the national average, very close to the Kansas is right at the national average. Missouri is just a little bit below in expenditure based on cost of living. It isn't money. We're spending plenty of money. For the first time, if you look closely at the Kansas Supreme Court decision, the recent one, they've just backed off a little bit, actually, from saying money is the most important thing. The previous two decisions basically said it's all about money. If it were, we'd be performing really well. But we're not. And in Kansas City, I want to tell you a fact that I think is startling, I think is true. None of our school districts, with one probable exception, the Center School District, none of our school districts in the metro area, and I'm talking about the suburban Kansas districts as well, outperforms its demographics. The Blue Valley school system is a pretty good school system. It ought to be a very, very good school system based on its demographics, which are among the best in the United States, the best in the world. And it's not quite that good. And the fact that we don't know that comes to the central point of Amanda Ripley's book, and I'll let her tell it, but I'll just say this to you, is I think the key thing that I take from this book, and there are many, many things to take from this book. It's the best book about education in the world and the best book about education in America in the last couple of years, for sure. And that is the real problem, our real problem, is that we don't value learning enough. She has a little anecdote, very little anecdote in the book, but that struck home with me. In Korea, students, the libraries in Korea are so crowded that students have to pay. They have to pay a fee to reserve a place in the library. I went to Hong Kong and Singapore with the Urban Library Council to see their libraries, the Hong Kong and Singapore libraries, and I had the same experience. There were people everywhere. There were special libraries for the special study areas for teenagers in Singapore that were reserved days in advance and were always crowded. And at the end of the day, unless we all, and I think everybody in this room probably you feel and do value learning, but as a community we don't value learning enough. That, at the end of the day, is the real reason. There's been no real protest about the State Board of Education backing away from reform. No real protest about even some of our wealthier districts not performing as well as they should. You know, where is the march on City Hall? Where is the march on the school board? If you listen to Amanda Ripley closely tonight, you may find that a reason to do it because some other countries have done it. And so I will now turn it over to her. Ladies and gentlemen, Amanda Ripley.
Well, thank you very much for that introduction, and thank you to the Kauffman Foundation and Kansas City Library for bringing me here, and all of you for coming out tonight. It is great to be here. I want to talk to you a little bit tonight about a mystery. I want you to leave this place behind, although it's a beautiful place. Leave it behind for the next 40 minutes or so, and come with me on a global quest to try to help solve a mystery that starts with data and ends with the life chances of millions of children. It's a mystery that I heard about again and again as a reporter for Time and for The Atlantic. I kept hearing about these countries, right? These countries that supposedly have all these brilliant, perfect kids and all these amazing teachers and wondrous parents and everything is wonderful all the time. And I couldn't quite believe it. You know, I just didn't believe that this was for real. And I wanted to know, what is it like to be a kid in these places? What is it like on a Tuesday in February to be in Seoul, South Korea, and going to school? And most of all, I wanted to know, how did these countries get so smart? Because here's the dirty little secret about these countries. They were not always so smart. And that is incredibly encouraging, right? It sometimes can feel here in the United States, and we keep hearing about our relatively mediocre performance compared to other countries, it sometimes can feel hopeless, or at least stagnant, right? But it turns out that our situation, if you can see the United States is sort of this dark orange color here, our trajectory, if you look at test scores over time, realizing that's a wildly imperfect metric, but it is one that we have, what you see is not a lot of change. And it turns out that is actually the exception. So what you see all around the world is this incredible movement. So you know Finland in the blue here, you've probably heard perhaps that Finland has one of the best education systems in the world, and Korea and Japan. Look at Canada. Canada has a remarkable story of improvement, despite the fact that Canada has a very high immigrant intake. Canada doesn't like the federal government either. Canada runs its education at the local level and has a 16% child poverty rate, which is approaching that of the United States, much higher than Finland. So this is, to me, incredibly hopeful, which is why I stopped everything else I was doing and decided to spend a year traveling around the world trying to get some vivid sense of what these countries were doing and what, if anything, we could learn from them and what we definitely wouldn't want to learn from them, because there are those lessons too. But I want you to try to maintain this sense of motion and change as we talk. And we're going to have time for questions and comments, by the way. So please keep that in mind, because I really do want to hear from all of you. So one of the things that you notice here, right, is that there are some countries that have actually declined over time. So imagine how that must feel, right? I mean, we beat up on ourselves quite a bit for being average in reading and science and below average compared to the developed world in math. But imagine if you were Norway. Now, this is fascinating because, look, we all know that the United States is a big, diverse country, that we have a significant level of child poverty, that we have wildly different states. I mean, Minnesota, Texas, Massachusetts, California, these are essentially countries unto themselves. We have lots of challenges. But you know, Norway is a country with less than 6% child poverty. Norway is a country with a very generous universal health care system. Actually, Norway is one of only 4 countries that spends more per pupil on kindergarten through 12th grade education than we do. What is going on in Norway? So, most of all, I see this journey as a hopeful one. Change is possible, and actually it is the norm all around the world. So I knew that I wanted to see what it was like to be a kid in these countries. And the only way, unfortunately, since I can't go back in time and be a kid, the only way I can do that is to ask students to be my field agents, my boots on the ground. I noticed this as a reporter in the US, that there were so many stories written about what adults thought about education, and the principals and the teachers and the parents and the school board, and everyone was quoted. And then there'd be some picture of some smiling, silent kid, and you never heard from this kid. And so it turns out that, first of all, talking to students for your reporting makes your stories 1,000 times more interesting. So that's just like an easy win for me, right? Secondly, if you don't talk to kids, you're wrong about something big. So basically, what I've noticed is I can be totally convinced of some theory about what's going on in a given classroom or neighborhood or school. And I'll talk to all the usual suspects. And then I'll spend about 7 minutes talking to a group of kids from that classroom. And they will totally eviscerate my theory, just like that, without even knowing it. I mean, without nothing intentional. Because it turns out that the reality on the ground is much more complicated always than you think. And also, it turns out that students have strong opinions on what they see in school. They spend a lot of time thinking about it. And we sometimes forget this as adults, how much time kids have to contemplate their situation. And they do. And they don't know everything, neither do I, but they know some things very well. So, luckily, it turns out there are 30,000 teenagers who every year essentially switch places, either coming to the United States and living with a host family for a year and attending a public high school, or leaving the United States and doing the same abroad. These kids are like this incredible asset, right? They're amateur anthropologists who know two things really well. They know their home and their school and their neighborhood back in the States, and they know their home and their school and the neighborhood abroad. And they think a lot about those contrasts. So, I knew I needed these kids to help me see into the blind spots that the research and the data cannot begin to get at. So I recruited 3 American students that I want to quickly introduce to you here and talk a little bit about what they taught me and what their fellow students and their parents and their teachers taught me. Because if I had not done that, and if they had not so generously cooperated, this would have been a totally different book, and it would have been insufferably boring. And I would have been really sure that I was right about everything. But they made me think of totally different things that I never would have focused on. So this is Kim. Kim is at the time, she was a 15-year-old from rural Oklahoma, and from Sallisaw, Oklahoma. She had never left the United States, born and bred in Oklahoma, and she had a single mother who was a teacher, who also had not left the US. But she had this inexplicable itch to go travel. She felt like there was something out there, and she wanted to see it. Now, partly this is that she never really felt like she fit in to her town. I mean, a lot of people feel that way, especially by adolescents, right? So it was not highly unusual. But she had tried to do the things that mattered in her town, you know, to her credit. She was a cheerleader in kindergarten, and she had this adorable daffodil-colored uniform, and she was really into it. And this is, you know, like many towns in America, football and basketball, in this case, are really the heart of the culture of the town for kids. But she was terrified of doing a cartwheel. And that really limits your ability to grow as a cheerleader. So by 3rd grade, she was cut from the team. And then after that, she tried to be in the band, because that's another path into the town square in America. And she took up the flute, and she practiced, and she tried, and she took lessons, and, you know, she just wasn't that good at it. I'm sorry, you know, she was like 7th chair in this little town. So that's not good. So she was complaining one day about her town, and she was complaining that she wanted to live somewhere where people were curious, and, you know, just kind of being a teenager in some ways. And her older sister called her bluff, and she said to her, well, why don't you go on one of those exchange programs if you want to go somewhere? Go. And she said, what do you mean? She said, well, you do these things where you go live abroad. And she said, well, that's for rich kids. And her sister said, well, all right. But then that night, Kim started Googling exchange programs. And she found out that these things actually existed. So then she started imagining herself in different countries. And then she read that Finland had the smartest kids in the world. And she said, that's where I want to go. So she goes to her mom the next day, and she says, I'm going to go study abroad for a year in Finland. And her mom does something very risky, which is she decides to say, well, that's fine. If you can raise the $10,000 that program costs, and you can do all the paperwork, go ahead. So Kim's pretty stubborn, actually. And so she spends all of freshman year in Oklahoma raising the money to go to Finland. So she holds a bake sale outside the local supermarket, and she sells beef jerky door to door, and she sells her flute on eBay for $90. Actually, it was a good move, turns out, to somebody in Dubai. You know, it was thrilling. And she writes a letter to every single business in the town's Chamber of Commerce list, asking if someone will help her pay for this trip to Finland. No one responds. This is right in the middle of the recession, to be fair. Right on the tail end of it. But what I love about Kim is that she doesn't give up, you know? She doesn't see herself as a sort of sad victim of an apathetic Chamber of Commerce or whatever. She continues. She starts a blog and she asks strangers for money. She gets lucky, she gets a couple scholarships. Next thing you know, to everyone's surprise, including her own, she has $10,000. And she is posted to a rural town on the west coast of Finland. Interestingly, sent to live with another single mother. So, off she goes, going from a state that if states were countries, would rank about 82nd in the world in math, to a country that ranks about 6th. So she's going from one of the lower performing states in the country for a variety of reasons to one of the top performing countries in the world. And then we have Eric. Eric is from, essentially, for all intents and purposes, a different country, educationally speaking, than Kim. Because Eric lives in Minnesota, one of the top performing states in the US, right up there with Massachusetts. We have anyone from Massachusetts? Minnesota? There we go. See? Obviously you're here tonight. So Massachusetts and Minnesota are two states that really do perform respectably compared to the rest of the world, not just in reading, but in math and science. Not at the very top, but I'll take Massachusetts scores any day. So Eric goes from Minnesota. Now he basically has every opportunity this country can offer him, this kid. He comes from an intact family who lives in a relatively affluent suburb of Minneapolis, a beautiful school that's regularly ranked as one of the top high schools in the country by one of those rankings. I have no idea what that means, but it is. And within this school, he's on the International Baccalaureate track. He does drama, he does extracurriculars. You know, he's got the best we can offer. So he goes from that to South Korea. So this is an interesting decision that Eric made. Eric basically was kind of burned out from this intense American high school experience. It was holistic, and there was an IB test, and it was intense. And he decides he wants to take a year off from academics. So he goes to this Rotary International Fair, and there's different booths for different countries. And he gets to the Korea booth, and the kids are super nice and funny and effervescent. And so he decides he wants to go to Korea, which is the absolute worst place to go in the world to take an academic break. I cannot think of a worse place. So there are different models for the countries that, by any metrics we can see, are really at the top of the world as far as not only their average scores, but their equity, their ability to deliver an outstanding education to almost all kids regardless of their socioeconomic background. There are different paths to get there, it turns out. Just like there are different ways to climb a mountain. You can do the sort of switchback, and you can bring water, and you can take breaks. That's Finland. That's what we'll call the utopia model of an education superpower, where the kids probably don't do as much homework on average as American kids. They don't have grades until 5th grade. They don't have report card grades. They do very few standardized tests. There isn't this huge amount of pressure on kids to study night and day. And yet, they're getting to the top of the mountain. Finland, keep in mind, had a 10% high school graduation rate in the 1950s. 10% is not good, right? We can all agree on that. Now they're at 96%, compared to 77% in the United States. It used to be we had the highest high school graduation rate in the world. And we really haven't changed. This is important. Sometimes these things get exaggerated in the media, whatever that is. I'm not part of that. But those people over there exaggerate our performance and say that we are terrible and we're the worst. That's not true. We're about average for the developed world in reading and science, and we're below average in math, consistently, by the time kids are 15. We do better in the younger years on international tests, and we do better in reading. And to me, that should be encouraging. Because if we can do better in reading, we could theoretically one day do better in math. So we are not the worst, and we are not the best. We are in the middle. And we have always been in the middle. There was no golden day when everyone was perfect and all the children were brilliant and all the parents were super. That doesn't exist, at least not to the degree we can find evidence. So we've kind of stayed the same. It's other countries that have changed. So Finland is this utopia model of switchbacking up the mountain, very civilized. South Korea is the pressure cooker model. And South Korea is the extreme version of a model you see all over Asia and parts of Eastern Europe. So this is a model where kids are going to school for very long school days, and then 77% of teenagers in South Korea go to after-school tutoring, like test prep, like Kaplan or Princeton Review, but on steroids. So imagine it's a secondary school system. It's a whole system. We don't really have anything like this, which is a good thing. But it's really a shadow of everything that's happened during the day, a shadow education system, where kids are taking all the same classes they take during the day. They're taking them again, except their parents are paying for it. And it's a fascinating, quite sophisticated free market for tutoring and education. And there are teachers who make millions of dollars in that market because the demand is extremely high and it's disaggregated at the teacher level. So parents and kids, they sign up for a teacher that they believe to be extremely effective. They don't sign up for a school, necessarily. So it's a fascinating model. There's a lot to learn from it. But no one in South Korea would say it's a good model. In fact, everyone everywhere complains about their education system, which is kind of interesting. It's sort of like healthcare. And it's perversely reassuring, right? You're like, oh, okay, well, if no one's happy, then maybe. But in Korea, they really, really complain. And you know who complains most of all? Is the kids. Yeah, the kids complain. And you know what's just sort of heartbreaking? I mean, it's dangerous to generalize, but I'm just going to do it anyway. All the countries I went to, there were no kids as joyful as a group than the kids I met in South Korea. I mean, so South Koreans are known as sort of the Italians of Asia. Like they're more emotive than some of the other, just again, to stereotype wildly. Has anyone been to Korea? Oh, okay, quite a few people. So, it's a vivid, lively culture with a lot of color and a lot of flash and a lot of confusing things happening. And actually, Eric loved it there. He loved Korea, but he hated school. He loved the culture and the clothing and the food. I mean, this kid was game. Like, he would try anything, this kid. He was adaptable. He learned Korean. I mean, it's not easy to do, but he learned it really well while he was there. And when I visited him, by the time I came, he could take me all around and, introduce me to everyone, order food. I mean, this is a kid who, just because he felt like it was the right thing to do, ate a live baby octopus off a chopstick. I mean, this kid is open-minded. You know what I'm saying? But when he went to school and he saw on his very first day of school, in his very first class, he looked back at one point, maybe 20 minutes into the class, and a third of the students were asleep. And they were asleep because they'd stayed up so late studying, which is crazy. So that's the pressure cooker model. And then the last student I want to tell you about is Tom. Tom came from Gettysburg, Pennsylvania, and he also wasn't super into sports, but his high school was super into sports. Tom was one of these kids who just always took the contrary view. He liked independent movies, he listened to Sonic Youth, he read philosophy. He once spent an entire winter just reading Chekhov. He played the cello quite well. And he kind of romanticized Eastern Europe, and he had this idea that if he could get out of high school and just escape, just, eject out of his seat in Gettysburg High School and spend a year in Eastern Europe, then he could read philosophy in smoke-filled coffee shops. And that's what he did? He went to Wrocław, Poland, from Pennsylvania to Poland. And when I visited him, one of the first things he took me to do was to go have coffee at Literatka, which was a smoke-filled coffee shop with philosophy books on the walls. And he was like, "Isn't this great?" And I was like, "It's really smoky, dude. I forgot what this is like." So Tom goes to Poland, and this is the third model, and the last model we'll talk about, the metamorphosis. Poland is the untold story of education. Poland, in the year 2000, 15-year-olds in Poland were scoring below average for the developed world in math, reading, and science, below 15-year-old Americans. Poland has a 16% child poverty rate. Poland, has anyone been to Poland? This is a well-traveled group. So Poland is a place with a long, tortured history of trauma, of dislocation. In fact, the town that Tom moved to, the city, Wrocław, was a German city before the Germans lost World War II, and the Poles took it over. The Allies took it over and moved it. It became part of Poland, and people were just moving into Germans' homes, and they changed all the street names, and they tried to pretend like it had never been German. This is a complicated place, is what I'm trying to say, okay? Complicated place. And in year 2012, Polish 15-year-olds scored above average for the developed world in math, reading, and science, well above the United States. They have a much higher high school graduation rate, and they spend 50% what we spend on K through 12 education per student. That is a remarkable trajectory. Poland now has a greater percentage of kids scoring an advanced level in math than Finland, which is in many ways a much easier country in some ways to manage from an education standpoint. So Tom decided to go to Poland for these romantic ideas, and I followed him to Poland for this metamorphosis. Because what you really want to see is not just Finland today or Korea today, you want to see the change. You want to see how they did it. But since we can't go back in time, we can go back and see Poland. So what did they tell us? What did they learn, these kids? Well, on a very basic level, one thing they all said, and I actually ended up surveying hundreds of exchange students to see if they agreed, 9 out of 10 of them said that school in the US was just easier. It was actually not super complicated in their point of view. They felt like there were a lot of awesome things about their American schools. So the exchange students who come here from other countries say this. They like how friendly their teachers are. So 89% of American 15-year-olds say their teacher cares about their well-being, compared to 15% of 15-year-olds in Japan. That's pretty cool. They love that they have the yearbook and track and all these extracurriculars, because in most countries, school is just about school, my friend. There is nothing else. Sports are not part of school. Sports happen outside of school, when they happen at all. So the exchange students really like that. But they almost all agree on one thing, which is that school is super easy in America. They'll say things like, "Who knew you could get points just for coming to class?" There was a Finnish exchange student that I spent a lot of time talking to who lived in Michigan, in a town that was in many ways much like her own town in Finland. It was pretty much all white, upper middle class, cold. And on her first math test in her American high school, she got 105%. Now, she had not known this was mathematically possible until she came to America. And she had this great journalism teacher in her school in Michigan. She really respected her. She felt like everyone did, and they were really learning. And the end of semester project for this class was you had to write 10 articles. So on the last day of class, Elena, our girl from Finland, shows up, and she's the only one with the 10 articles. Isn't that interesting? Can't believe it. And then in her US history class, she takes a quiz, and she's nervous because it's US history, and she gets an A. And the kids sitting around her get C's. And one of them looks at her grade and starts laughing and says, "How is it possible that you got an A and I got a C?" And she said, "I don't know. How is that possible?" Because it wasn't that Elena knew so much about US history. It's that the teacher had handed out a study guide for the test with all of the questions. And so she had just read that. So I'm exaggerating a little, right? I mean, you can always pick out these anecdotes. There are things that the United States is rigorous about, and it's more rigorous about reading than many countries in the world. But math in particular is a weak point at every socioeconomic status, and we are systematically underestimating what kids can do. So even our top quartile of most affluent kids in America, who, by the way, are very well off compared to top quartile affluent kids around the world, who have very highly educated parents and computers and all manner of resources, those kids score below their affluent peers in 26 other countries in math. So don't let anyone tell you that our low poverty schools are just fine. In some ways, they are awesome, but not in math. So one thing they learned was that school was harder. It was less forgiving in some ways, which is complicated, but that is one thing that they agree on. One reason that school is harder, not the only reason, by a long shot, but one reason is that in most of the top performing countries in the world, it is much, much harder to become a teacher. The training is much more rigorous, and you have a lot more time with a very accomplished teacher as a student teacher to learn and get feedback. So I'm showing you this picture because this is a teacher I met in Finland. Very funny guy. I went to his school because he has a third of his students are immigrants, mostly refugees from Iraq and Somalia and Afghanistan. And that's very diverse for a Finnish school, obviously, so I wanted to see that. And his kids really liked him. You could tell they respected him. He was a funny guy. I really enjoyed talking to him. He did not get into education college on his first attempt, which is very common in Finland. He did not get in on his second attempt. I guess he really wanted to be a teacher because on his third effort, the third year, after doing all kinds of things to boost his application, he got in. Now, do I think this guy would have been a good teacher if he got in on the first attempt? Yes, I do. But here's the thing I had underestimated before I went to these countries. In the late 1960s, when Finland shut down its education colleges of wildly varying selectivity and quality, just like ours, and moved them into its top 8 most elite universities, Finland sent a signal to everyone in the country about how important teaching was and how hard it was. So kids in Finland complain about their teachers. Here's the thing, kids are basically the same. I mean, they spend too much time on Facebook in every country. They spend too much time on video games in every country. They complain. In every country I've been to, there's some kid in the back texting illegally in every classroom. Like, it is universal. But kids in Finland, despite their complaints, they know how hard it was for this guy to become a teacher. Because getting into an ed school in Finland, an education college, is as hard as getting into MIT in the United States. You need to have test scores and the equivalent of SAT scores in the top 10% of your graduating high school class. Now again, does that make you a great teacher? It does not. But think about what it means. Think about the cascading implications if all the kids and all the parents and all the politicians know how hard it was for you to become a teacher, how well educated and well trained and well supported you are. And then think about how much easier it is to make the case to pay teachers more and to give them the autonomy and respect that they need to do what is an extremely difficult job. We say it's a hard job in this country, and we do not act like it. Not in this state, not in any state. Another thing the kids noticed, very aesthetic, very obvious, and it seemed superficial at first, the schools were not super impressive to look at. So when I surveyed hundreds of exchange students, 7 out of 10 of them said that they saw more technology in their US classrooms. And all 3 American kids I followed said the same thing. So Tom, for example, from Pennsylvania, his school in Pennsylvania, which is sort of middling performing school, his school had digital whiteboards, smart boards in every classroom. There were laptops, carts, and there were beautiful labs and a state-of-the-art theater. His school in Poland didn't even have a cafeteria, let alone 3 gymnasiums and fields and smart boards. There were no smart boards. And this is true all around the world. We know, there's not a ton of data on this, but one thing we know is that American high school principals report that they have about 1 computer, almost 1 computer per student at this point. And if you compare that to Poland, South Korea, and Finland, you see a surprising disconnect. We tend to invest a lot of hope and money in shiny objects in America, not just in education, but in hospitals, in homes. And it's something that we should maybe think about, and think about those investments, and think about whether we have evidence that they're leading to learning before we make them. Every time I read that another district has bought iPads for all of its second graders, it kills me a little bit. So this is actually a field. This is the field at Eric's school in Busan, South Korea. It's a pretty typical field in other countries. And the kids play pickup soccer there when every chance they get. They run around it during PE, and it's an afterthought. It is not part of the purpose of school. The last thing I want to talk about briefly is parents. Again, something that the kids brought to me. The one thing they noticed is that they never saw parents at school in these other countries. Even if you go to an elementary school in Finland, you're unlikely to encounter a parent. Which is sort of surprising, because we all know that, the more involved parents are in their kids' education, the better the kids do, right? Well, it turns out that American parents are actually quite involved in their kids' education and are more likely to show up at school for meetings and events than they were 20 years ago. 9 out of 10 American parents attended some kind of school meeting in the last year. The difference is in how we define parental involvement. So parents in Finland and Korea are very involved in their kids' education at home. And what my kids' school in Washington, D.C., a public school, asked me to do as a parent almost never has anything to do with learning. There are really cool, fun things that happen, right? There are bake sales, and there are fiestas, and there are moon bounces. But none of those things lead to learning, unfortunately. What does lead to learning? Well, it's actually pretty cool. We kind of know. In one study of 13 very different countries and regions all over the world, parents who spent more time participating in PTAs and volunteering and extracurricular activities at school, incredibly, if you control for everything else, including background, ended up with kids who performed worse in a test of reading by age 15. But parents who read to their kids regularly when they were little, and then as they got older, asked them about their days, talked to them about the news of the day, about books, movies, those parents, even after controlling for everything else you can control for, had parents who performed kids who performed significantly better on a test of critical thinking by age 15 in reading. So to me, this is actually really good news, because parents want to do things, but they need to be led. They need to be directed towards things that actually lead to learning, especially in math. So as a parent myself, this fundamentally changed how I prioritize what I do. Because I'm just like all of you, I have like this much free time. So I have to make decisions, hard decisions about how to spend it. So I get robocalls from my kids' school asking me to please show up at Chipotle because today they're donating 1% of profits to the school. So the first year this happened, this was before I finished the book, I went to Chipotle. It was like 100 degrees in DC. It was like 1,000% humidity. In America, you can have 1,000% too. I don't know if you know. And we're waiting in line. There's like 200 kids with their families, all trying to do this good thing, right? To help their school. And we're trying to protect the kids from running into traffic, and it's like a nightmare. And I get my burrito, and like 8 cents goes to the school or whatever. And then I go home, and do you think I read to my kid that night? I do not. I do not read to my kid that night. I'm just trying to survive at that point. Do you know what I'm saying? I mean, I worked all day. I've been in line at Chipotle for an hour and a half. You know, I'm done. So you see how these trade-offs that we have to make, right? I'm pretty sure my kid's not smarter because of that 8 cents. I don't know. So there are lots of complexities to all of this, and I hope we can talk about some of this in the time that we have remaining to do a little Q&A. So there are microphones here. But one thing that I want to end with is to point out that this is possible. And it's discouraging, and it's hard. I mean, I never get more death threats and nasty emails than when I write about education. It is like, you know, I spend like 50% of my time vowing to never do it again. And then I gotta do it again. I mean, I used to write about like guns and abortion and terrorism, but I never got the kinds of emails that I got. I mean, it's crazy. So it's, you know, I know that it's complex, and I don't want to suggest that it's not. But I will say in total candor that I didn't see anything anywhere in any country that I don't think we could do as well or better, and that we aren't already doing as well or better in specific individual classrooms all over this country. So instead of using these international comparisons to argue about whether we are terrible or awesome, I think we could learn from them and get hope from them. And the way to learn the most from them and to get the most hope and actionable advice is to talk to kids. Interestingly, this is a very obscure data point, but I'm going to share it with you. Education systems that regularly solicit feedback from their students about how they're doing perform significantly better overall than education systems that don't. Convenient data point that actually just fits with my worldview, so I'm going to share it. It's a complicated thing to explain causality, like all of these things. But to me, there's a ring of truth to it. You know, in all the fights we have about education, the one constituency we rarely hear from is the constituency that has the most at stake. So as we continue in every state and every town to figure out what to do next, because whether we like it or not, these are the kids that we're competing with. And whether it's fair or not, the skills that kids need to thrive in the modern economy are different than the skills I needed, and most of us needed. Kids need to learn to think for themselves, right? And we like to think we do that, right? That we have this, you know, we got the creativity thing down because of Steve Jobs or something, who, by the way, hated school and probably would have been in prison if he went to school today. Seriously. I mean, he set off fireworks in like his 3rd grade classroom. Today, that doesn't, you don't play with that. That doesn't work. So it's hard to measure creativity, right? But on the PISA test of international systems, which is some of the data I've been referencing here today, which is a test administered to 15-year-olds in 60 countries every 3 years by the OECD. This is a test that's designed to get at your ability to think, to reason, to solve problems you haven't seen before in math, reading, and science. I actually took the test myself to see what it was like. I'm a huge nerd, so for me this was like an amazing day that they had to convince, it was really hard to convince them to let me take the test because they thought I was gonna, like, I don't know, write down the questions and tell America or cheat or something. So I had to sign an affidavit that I would never reveal the exact questions. But I do reveal questions they have publicly released in the book. And I will say, it was unlike any standardized test I'd ever taken. It did require me to think. I had to write longhand answers to many questions, and you could tell there was no one right answer. You'd get different points depending on the coherence and specificity of your argument. And guess what? That's how you get points in life. So the skills that I needed to do well on that test were the same skills, not just that you need in college. Actually, it felt more to me like the skills you need in life. Like the other day, I had to pick out an individual health care plan for my family. I'm one of those people, right? The Obamacare people, right? Because I am a freelancer, so I needed health care. So I had to compare all these different plans, and it's apples to oranges, like deductibles and this and that, and out-of-network and point of service. Oh my God. That is the exact kind of skills, to take large amounts of information, which is cheap these days, and make sense of it and analyze risk. Those are the kinds of skills kids need. And if that is a form of critical thinking and creativity, then we are not getting it done at the level we think, not at any socioeconomic level. But we could. We could. Thank you all so much for listening. It's been a real honor to be here.
Some questions for Amanda. If you would please come up to the microphones with your question, and if you have a statement pro or con, would you please make it and then turn it into a question? And she will be happy to sign books afterwards.
What do you see as some of the primary barriers to the educational system in the United States making the kind of changes that you feel that it needs to make to change the kinds of situations that you described this evening?
That's a great question. What are the barriers to change in the United States? I'm going to give you just two, because one is very tangible and specific, and one is more amorphous. One is that, one thing we have never done in this country, not in any state, is to make it much more serious to train and educate yourself to become a teacher. And the barriers to progress in that sense have to do with higher ed, in most cases. Education is not taken seriously on the campuses of American colleges, with some exceptions. And that's why it is the second most popular major in the country, and that's why we educate more than twice as many teachers as we actually need in our schools. And that's why colleges make a good deal of money off of it. And that's why they offer special math classes for teachers to be, not in the math department. And that's why if you test our middle school teachers to be, on average, realizing there are huge exceptions, on average, our middle school teachers in training perform below average for the developed world in math, right where our kids perform. So this is an area for progress. It's not easy, but it's also not impossible. I mean, really? Like, we have districts that, like the one I come from, that has taken on tenure. And it's been ugly, let me tell you. I'm not sure I totally recommend it. I do wish that political capital had been spent on the education colleges. So if you can start from the beginning, making teaching a very serious profession and sending that signal out to everyone involved, everything gets a little easier. Yeah.
I would like for you.
I was going to say a second ineffable thing. I'm sorry.
Well.
The more amorphous thing, and I'm going to literally take 20 seconds, is that we need a consensus among the public about the real vivid importance of mastering hard academic skills. I don't think we've got that consensus yet. These other countries didn't always have it. It usually comes because of an economic existential crisis. And you suddenly realize that if you don't get real about that, you're going to be in a world of hurt. Go ahead.
Well, thank you. Your comments are terrific. Thank you. I just want you to comment, if you have some comments, on some of the bright spots in American education. I have lived recently in Massachusetts for a number of years, and my statistics might be off a little bit, but as I recall, recently it was said that if Massachusetts were a country, it would rank 4th in the world, and that the Massachusetts 8th graders tied with Singapore for first place in mathematics. First place in the world. So what is going on in Massachusetts, and what are the lessons for the rest of us? And maybe also for Minnesota, which does very well. So
yeah, no, you're absolutely right. I mean, Massachusetts and Minnesota are great examples of what is possible. And, when you say this to people, they say, oh, but those are homogenous, relatively well-off states. And this is a conversation you get into a lot. And it might be true. I mean, so is Norway, So are lots of American states are homogenous, and they don't perform like Maine. It's like Massachusetts. Maine is an example of one that doesn't perform like Massachusetts. And it's 94% white, so I don't know that homogeneity is the only secret to success. Massachusetts is a great example. And over the 90s and over the past 10 years as well, Massachusetts got more serious about teacher training, about its curriculum, about its standards. And it was not an easy fight. I mean, I think the head of schools was burned in effigy at one point. It was not a walk in the park. But that is something I think that does offer us a great deal of hope. And like I was saying, the fact that we have teachers who kids think vaguely care about them and also are willing to let kids talk once in a while is very different than many school systems around the world that are much more old-fashioned in their classrooms. So when you're trying to teach 21st century skills, you do sometimes need to speak, right? So that's actually a great strength that we have. I also find it, this is we could do a whole nother night on this, but I find it encouraging that 46 states have agreed to the Common Core state standards of what kids should know at every grade level in math and reading. This is controversial. This is a debate that we need to have. But it's kind of a prerequisite to a coherent, strong, equitable system. And Finland did it, and Poland did it, and Korea did it. Everybody got together and said, here's a list of fewer, more rigorous things for what kids should know. Now teachers, you go have the flexibility to teach that however you want, but you got to get to this end point. And that, if we can stick with this, and I think we can make changes along the way, every country does, but if we can stick with the Common Core, it injects a level of rigor and coherence and clarity into a system that lacks all three. Yeah.
Hello. I was wondering, in Massachusetts, I don't know too much about how it compares to other states or other countries, but we really push for full inclusiveness, whether that's English language learners or students that may have special learning disabilities. I was wondering if you knew anything about that as far as other states or other countries?
That's a great question about inclusiveness. And I think, from the standpoint of English language learners and special education, we have a lot of variance from state to state, but overall, we are leading the world. So what we do in special education of trying, ideally, to integrate kids into classrooms when possible, and we don't do this everywhere, we don't always do it well, that is cutting edge. And that is what Finland does, actually. Finland is an interesting, and I won't go into too much detail, but Finland basically is very front-loaded on the special education. So half of Finnish kids, by the time they graduate from high school, were at some point classified as special ed. So what this means is that it removes some of the stigma and the sense that you're either one or the other, you're either special ed or you're not, but it's a fluid designation. And what they do is they really, early on in a kid's education, as soon as they notice some kind of problem, they descend on that kid like a pit crew. So if you invest early in early intervention and keep kids together with the same content when possible, but do that kind of targeted intervention, then it's a lot cheaper later, right, in high school. So that is something that Finland's very strong on, Korea is very weak on. The data I've been referencing, for whatever it's worth, does include a representative sample of all kids, even kids in private school and public school. So it is relatively apples to apples, and there's some exceptions to that, like that's just why I don't talk a lot about China and about some of the other places that take these tests, because it's still not quite apples to apples as far as who takes the test, but that's a really good question, and I think speaks to the values of equity in a place like Finland and in some American places. Yeah.
Is there a difference between the countries with regard to parental expectation and how they expect their children to perform in school?
Yeah. There's a great book that came out last year called Parenting Without Borders by a woman who, very thoughtful. She's from Japan, but lived here for a long time, has 2 kids that she raised in Massachusetts, and then they moved back to Japan. And she was really struck by the differences. Like on the playground, she was the only one on the play structure. Like all the other parents were like, what are you doing? You need to chillax. Like you should not be on the play structure. And then when she gets back to the US, right away, one of the first things she does is she goes to a shopping mall. They have one of those carousels, like a merry-go-round. And she sees this father, with the goodness of his heart, he takes his kid after the kid's gone on the merry-go-round, takes him off, he's 2 years old, and he says, good riding, good riding. And it really struck her, having been in Japan for a while. She was like, good riding. So we know that we tend to overpraise our kids. compared to other countries. There are exceptions, and it's hard to generalize, right? And some of this depends on socioeconomic status. But we know from the really interesting research that people like Martin Seligman have done into optimism and grit and all those things, we know that there are two ways that you can really disable a kid and remove the resilience, or make it harder for a kid to be resilient. One way is toxic stress in the early years, poverty, violence. That's one way you can do it. And another way you can do it is by praising them and coddling them all the time so they never know what it's like to make a decision for themselves or to fail. So it seems like we've got both of those covered, which is a little bit worrisome. But I believe Paul Tuff is coming to speak here in a couple of months, who wrote a great book all about this, about both ends of the socioeconomic spectrum and how you teach character strengths like grit, but also optimism and empathy and all those really powerful things that we know are much stronger predictors of life outcomes than IQ. So these are some things that places like Finland are doing, partly because of cultural differences. So kids, I mean, just the culture in Finland is much less fearful. Like, so you see kids walking around by themselves all the time, and they use power tools in school when they're like 7, and there's less litigation. There's a lot going on there, but I don't even know how I ended up here. Why don't you ask your question?
Hi, I was just wondering, do we have any sort of understanding of how a lot of these education indicators correlate with other more general aspects of quality of life and stuff like that? Like
good question.
When Norway, when they had that decline in education, did that bleed into other aspects of life like GDP or something like that?
Yeah, that's a really good question. So yes and no. Economists have found a nearly one-to-one match between growth on those PISA test scores and economic growth over time, GDP. But let's be honest, many, many things lead to GDP. I mean, if each one of you were a factor in the equation that leads to GDP growth, we'd need like 100 more rooms full of people. So, things like how hard it is to declare bankruptcy, how hard it is to hire and fire, all these things are really, I mean, look at Japan, has outstanding education outcomes and, miserable recently economic outcomes with some recent improvements. So yes, we do see some correlation between some economic indicators, particularly when it comes to global competitiveness for high quality jobs. But you have a place like Norway that has oil and other things going on. It's hard to disaggregate what's causing what. We do know there was a longitudinal study of a very large, I think 30,000 kids over time that found that their PISA scores on that international test that we've been talking about were better predictors of college attainment than their report card grades. And interestingly, if you do, there was a really cool study that came out in just a few months ago of adult literacy and numeracy, and it really mirrors very closely the PISA results. So what you see over time is a shift where Finnish senior citizens perform about 12th in the world on a test of literacy, and American senior citizens perform about 4th. Go senior citizens. But then here's the thing. When you look at people in their 20s in both countries, it flips. So it's not that Americans are getting dumber. I mean, the younger Americans are outperforming the older Americans in the test of literacy, but they're like 17th. And the Finns, bless you, are like 4th. So you're seeing a generational flip in skills. Yeah.
You pointed out about how in Finland it's really hard to become a teacher, and that's nothing new. I mean, I read a number of years ago that when Tony Blair wanted to improve the English schools, he hired somebody in the 5 top countries that guy found. He found one thing in common. That was the teachers all came from the 3rd top of the college class. But if we want those kind of teachers, what do we have to do? I mean, we don't pay them. We demand crazy amount of time from them. How do we?
Yeah, that's a great question. Right now, according to the limited data that's available, this state, only about 1/3 of the education colleges require SAT scores in the top half of the distribution, whereas Finland's requiring 100% in the top 10%. So you see a huge difference there. And again, that's not all that matters, but it is a very powerful signal. In addition to, obviously, it's helpful to have a strong education to teach higher order skills. What do we have to do to get there? It's a little bit of a chicken and egg situation. So once you raise the bar and make sure everyone knows that you've done that, what you find, if you do it right, is that more people want to be part of it, right? It becomes prestigious because it's selective. The Finnish unions ran an advertisement in the 1980s. It's very simple. It said, Finland has the best educated teachers in the world. Just a statement of fact. Imagine the power of being able to say that. At the same time, right? Now, when Finland started this, very interesting, Finland was going through its own sort of no child left behind, top-down accountability movement. It wasn't as focused on standardized tests, but teachers had to keep an hourly diary of what they did. Schools had to submit a proposal for the year, which would be approved or disapproved by the National Inspectorate. Imagine if we had a National Inspectorate, oh my God. And there was an 800-page core standards, like our Common Core is pretty small, 800 pages in small font, you know, for every subject. That's still true, but it's much shorter now. So it was not a good time for teachers, right? But as they were doing this, they were also raising the bar, giving teachers a full year of student teaching with experienced teachers, and giving them more rigorous training in their subject matter. So what happened in the 80s is that they could take some of these top-down strictures away, and they did. And that is what Finnish teachers get all misty-eyed when they talk about, the ones who were around, because they rewrote the core standards with a lot of teachers involved. They took away a lot of this. They closed down the inspections, took away a lot of that, gave teachers a lot more autonomy, partly because they were respected, partly, not entirely, because they had earned respect through their training. So this is a big, complicated issue. I do think we should pay teachers more, but I don't think that's enough. I think we have time for, do we have time for one more? Okay. Okay, we'll do a speed round. Okay.
Okay, very quickly. I believe you said early on that in America we don't value education. I think that's one of the things you said. What is it that is going on in these other countries where the citizenship values education? What's the motivation for these students to do well?
Right, that is the big mystery, because honestly, there is no country in the world that rewards skills as lavishly as the United States, and there is no country, just by the numbers, that punishes people more brutally for a lack of skills. So you'd think if anywhere kids were able to connect the dots between what they were doing in school and how interesting and stable their lives would be, you'd think it would be here. But that hasn't happened yet. Obviously, some of that has to do with, I mean, there's a million things. Some of it is the privilege of relative wealth compared to other countries. You know, Finland was a backwater. I mean, it hadn't industrialized way after the other Nordic countries. It was mostly illiterate. I mean, it was, you know, it was very late to the party, as was Korea, thanks to the Korean War, among other things. So in these places, there was a vivid, visceral memory of what life looked like when there was no opportunity without academic success. Here, you could have some opportunity without academic excellence. That's changing, and that story needs to trickle down to everyone, right? But there's a lot of confusing signals that kids get in this country about what matters, notably sports, right? I mean, when colleges are paying them to play sports and admitting them based on sports, that is a very mixed signal. I'm seeing the walls coming down. Okay, two more.
Hey, I'm a teacher. I just want to say I think you're awesome. Okay, the other thing I wanted to say was, I had a question is, here in Kansas City, we're struggling with the Kansas City, Missouri School District accreditation issues, that kind of thing. My daughter being in the district. Do you think that charter schools potentially offer a way to usher in the sort of educational viewpoint that you come from? Does that make sense? Like, I think districts are kind of big, but maybe charter schools might be the way to go?
You know, I wish I could just say yes or no. I don't have all the answers, number one. Number two, what I can say is that all around the world, schools that have autonomy over their methods tend to do better, as long as they're also accountable for pretty rigorous outcomes. So a lot of this, the charter school results depend in large part by the systems in place, right, to approve charters and to keep things going. One risk you do see in other countries as well is the risk of segregation. And it's not always racial segregation or even ethnicity segregation. It's like, actually Sweden is a great example, and I'd like to go to Sweden for this purpose. Sweden has seen its PISA test scores go right down. At the same time that they have, among other changes, changed the whole system to be essentially charters. Now that may or may not be the reason, but that is a risk. You really can't rely just on the demand side of the equation. You can't just rely on parents to like pressure, just like you can't rely on patients to pressure hospitals to get better. You have to also work on the supply side. I mean, to me, I'm kind of agnostic. Like I want to see outstanding instruction and great leaders. I don't really give a crap what kind of school it is, you know what I mean? And I've seen that in DC traditional schools, and I've seen that in DC charter schools. So good luck to you. Thank you for doing the work that you do.
Thank you so much for your presentation. That was part of my question, but I also wondered, are you aware of or have there been studies, similar studies regarding private and parochial schools?
Yes, private schools. Let's end on that. So I like this. All around the world, private schools do not add statistical value once you control for socioeconomic background. So in other words, if you took the same kids and put them in public school, you would expect them to do just as well on PISA. So there's going to be some variance in that, obviously, a lot of variance depending on the private school and the parochial school. But you do not see the return that you might expect, at least from country to country. America actually has a relatively small percentage of kids in private school compared to the rest of the developed world. But again, the secret, if there is that it's about quality. You know, it's not about the structure or the quantity. It's not about the number of tests or the amount of homework or the kind of the label, the way, you know, it's about the quality. Now, obviously, those things influence the quality. But there's not a one universal truth about which path leads to the quality, except, I think, from the selection and training of teachers. Thank you so much.
I remind you that the book is for sale in the hall, and Ms. Ripley will be happy to sign your copy.